They say when you wear Black Power Media gear, you can accomplish anything. You play any and every position. From coaching, to kicking, to receiving, to running and juking. And, oh my goodness, I see that again in slow motion. Get off me. And you're going to have a lot of haters coming at you, but what you got to do is you got to shake them off, and get to your goal and accomplish it. And when that's done, it's a beautiful thing. I'm talking about going hard, extra, for that extra point. And when it's done beautifully, you talking about touchdown. Oh, and the crowd goes wild and they're celebrating with you and everything. Man, let's see that again. Nice.
Black Power Media, baby. That's how we do it.
Now go to blackpowermedia.org and get you some of that gear. Empower yourself today. Yeah.
Yes. Welcome once again to another edition of Guerrilla Intellectuals University. I'm Jared Ball, joined by my main man partner in crime, Kalanji Jamachanga. Greetings to you, sir. How you feeling this morning?
I'm alive on arrival, brother. You know, it's a great day to be African. How about that?
Always right on. Just FYI, Dr. Janine Jones is working with us in the background as usual, and Dr. Joy James is going to return with us next week. She had to be called away at the last minute this morning, and so we appreciate, respect, and understand that. We look forward to having her back with us ASAP. Just to remind everybody that for GIU, we have disabled the chat, so don't be confused or alarmed. We just do that so that folks can enjoy a singular focus on the program itself. If you do have any comments or questions, we are happy to field them during the show, simply by having you send that, as you see scrolling beneath us, to gintellectualsu@gmail.com. That's gintellectualsu.com, to send your comments or questions in, and then we will work them into the program as quickly and seamlessly as possible. That said, we have a big program this morning. We're going to start with a discussion about, as you see behind me, Malcolm X, whose unfortunate and the anniversary of his assassination will be tomorrow, February 21st. And to do that, we're going to be joined by Baba Zak Kondo, the premier historian on the history of Malcolm X. And then later in the program, we are going to begin our GIU discussion of the first part, as you see in the show description, of George Jackson's Blood in My Eye, and I cannot wait for that either. Yeah, all right, without further ado, let's get to it. Our guest this morning is Baba Zak A. Kondo, who, among many other things, holds the rank of full professor of history at Baltimore City Community College. He has spent more than 31 years teaching history and Black studies on the college level full-time. This is his 18th year at BCCC. He has also spent 15 years at Bowie State in Maryland, where he also founded and coordinated the Pan-African Studies program. At Bowie State, he was the youngest full-time faculty member in the school's history, having been hired at the age of 25. He has also won every teaching award possible during his tenure at that school. And, of course, the highlight of his biography, need not be said, is that he is a contributor to the book co-edited by Dr. Todd Stephen Burroughs and myself, A Live Reinvention Correcting Manning Marable's Malcolm X. But without further ado, we do bring to the virtual stage Baba Zak Kondo. Greetings to you, Baba. Good morning. Welcome back to the platform. Good to see you.
Baba Zak may have a delay.
How's everybody? Baba Zak, you're breaking up. You've been saying.
Yeah, it may be a slight internet connect on your side.
Yeah, unfortunately, I do think it is on your end, Baba Zak.
We all veterans and stuff, so it's all good.
Okay. We're gonna make it happen some kind of way, right?
Okay. Absolutely.
Not right now. Should I be hearing something?
Yeah, you know what? We may have to restart. Yeah, you may have to.
All right, let's see if we can get Baba Zak to reboot.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, But no, I mean it's definitely, you know, while Baba Zak is getting it together over there, it is an honor to have him on. I know you've had him on at least a couple times on I Mix What I Like. We had him on Riot Starter TV, I think it was last year, and it created such a controversy that Wesley Muhammad from the Nation of Islam responded. We had him on to talk about, to answer what Baba Zak was talking about. And I know Baba Zak had challenged him. Well, they challenged each other to a debate, and that didn't happen for whatever reason. I think Wesley Muhammad wanted to do it in person, and Baba Zak said virtual, and you know, it's just a whole different thing. But tonight, what we intend on doing today is, you know, we're not getting into any semantics or whatever the case is. We want to remind folks that Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz, Malcolm X, is one of our greatest heroes. He's a brother who inspired many of us. For me, if there was a quote unquote trilogy, not even a trilogy, a try, I would say Garvey, Malcolm, and somewhere between, I would say Huey, Malcolm Garvey Huey. You know, for folks who inspired many of us, who organize on that ground level. And that's not to say that there are no flaws. It's just to say that we look at growth, and we know that Malcolm, or Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz, was one of the you know, brothers who really just laid some type of foundation for many of us.
Yeah, there's no question. And just quickly, I see Baba Zak struggle a little bit with the connection. I just, if you could, Baba Kondo, make sure if you have an Ethernet cord, please use it, and make sure all your other tabs are closed out in the in your browser. Please make sure you've closed out all your tabs, and that might help, because it looks like he's even frozen in the studio back there. But just to add to that, just very quickly, certainly for our generation, people born in the late 60s, early 70s, and around that time, there is no singular figure greater than Malcolm in terms of bringing us into some sort of radical consciousness. So it's not it is a combination of a variety of things. His genius, his brilliance, the timing, his engagement with media, the fact of an exploding televised media right around the time of his emergence, the worldwide revolution that he was a part of and responding to, and then of course the state's participation and engagement in precipitating his assassination, or in conducting it, depending on how you view it. And for me, as to your point, it's not a matter of whether or not he was flawed. To me, the issue is, what was it that inspired so many of us and caused to this day, causes, I should say, in present tense, so much fear among those in power. It is that and the ideas with which he worked, and the way he articulated and tried to organize those ideas to be projected back to us, that I think makes Malcolm such a compelling and important figure. And Baba Kondo is one of the preeminent scholars in terms of not only emulating what it means to be a guerrilla intellectual, but in connecting those important dots. And I think what I've always appreciated most about his book Conspiracies is the context he offers of the state, of imperialism, of a global war, the fears of the Johnson administration and others that he inspired. So whatever people think about the nation or the nation's involvement, it's to me that context that sets the stage more than anything else. And in terms of his assassination, and as we come up on this another anniversary of that tomorrow, I think it's important to remember why he was targeted.
Right.
Anyway, so
and I want to point out too that I intend on tomorrow. I think that there's been some very important convo around his assassination. So tomorrow, as far as RSTV, we'll be playing 4.5 hours of interviews from a piece we did with Peter Goldman and Paul Lee, and also the piece that we did last year with Baba Zak. I'm going to do that back to back. To me, Malcolm is, and I know that some people have their issues or whatever. My thing is, don't play with me when it comes to Malcolm. That's just it. I look at Malcolm as a revolutionary prophet, you know, as a street intellect, as a guerrilla intellect. You know, so it's funny, not funny, but it's great that we're talking about both Alhaji Malik Shabazz and George Jackson today. I see Baba Zak is here, so
yeah, and I will say, and that's why we were asking if you could grab those headphones, because we are getting that echo and reverberation back at us. If
okay,
but I will say, just there we go, perfect. And one thing I just want to say very quickly before you get started is it continues to be, I doubt you even remember, but it continues to be a highlight of my life. To that one time that we got to, that I had the pleasure and privilege of chauffeuring you, Baba Zak, from Baltimore up to the Audubon Ballroom, and for an event, and getting to talk about even and as we crossed that George Washington Bridge, you even started talking about the assassination and how you thought the those who participated that day would have taken that similar route. And it was a little bit spooky on our way to the Audubon to have you sort of narrating that as we were driving, but it was a great experience. But anyway, welcome back, and it's good to have you here this morning.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much, and I appreciate that revelation, Baba. I do remember it, and I appreciate that you giving me the ride as well.
Oh yeah, that was an honor. I mean, I always used to like doing it. I used to always offer myself up to drive people, because it's a great way. You get all these extra conversations, you get all these little tidbits. Sometimes you get to overhear people saying things that are very interesting. So it's always good. But anyway. Maybe we could just have you start with a brief reminder of your work and what brought you to that work. I think that story is as many times as I've heard it, and as many times I'm sure you've told it, I think is very compelling and persistently relevant. So maybe if you could just start with that, what brought you to this research, and then we can get into maybe what you discovered.
Sure. I appreciate the opportunity as well. I came across Malcolm X the way most Afro came across Malcolm X. In fact, my wife is sitting here not far from me, and she came through Malcolm X, the same way. The autobiography of Malcolm X. When I was in the 7th grade, I read it. I didn't know nothing really about Malcolm X. I heard the name once or twice here and there, but I didn't know. And I read the book. I'm a military brat, and I was on the base, and I was in the library, and I was waiting for the bus to come. And I saw this book, and I pulled it out, and it was the old real thick book with the photographs and everything, hardcover. And it had a picture of this man, and he was speaking, and it said in the caption, "He rose from hoodlum, thief, dope peddler, pimp to become the most dynamic leader of the Black world." Said he would be murdered before this book appeared, and that caught my attention. I checked the book out. First, I started looking at it, and I started reading it on the bus. Actually, I started reading it in the library, but I checked it out, took it on the bus, and a whole new universe opened up to me. That I was a brother, I always made good grades. I was always smarter than everybody, but I never cared that for the whole school experience, particularly history, which I love for myself. But for Malcolm, this big thick book for a 12-year-old 7th grader, that was pretty demanding. But I spent the next week or so reading the book, and then after that, I read it again, and then the third time, I started memorizing, stuff. Like I still remember stuff that I memorized, from from different pages of the book and stuff like that. And from that point forward, I could to other Africans and people of that caliber. So what I would do is from Malcolm, I started reading other books. So I read in the seventh everything.
You know what? We might.
I was out on Malcolm.
Baba Zak, I think we're struggling with the connection again. I'm wondering if we might need to even try just having you go off camera and just be audio only, if that would help. I hate to say that, but I'm
okay.
Just struggling to hear you a
That's
little
fine.
bit there.
About where did when I was talking, where up at?
Up to that last part. It's just now you're starting to break up a little
Should
bit.
I call in?
Well, let's see if you could turn your camera off, see if that works first, and then we'll go from there.
Just stop your camera and leave your audio on and see if that
let's see if we can work on that. And for our viewing audience, these things happen. So we appreciate your patience, and it is a great experience nevertheless. And a great honor to have Baba Zak on board.
As we're waiting, Baba Zak, you should see a button that says "Stop Cam," and if you can just hit that, it'll turn your camera off, but your audio will still work, and we'll bring you back in the studio. But as I said a moment ago, we're starting to hear the story. He exemplifies. Well, now it says, Baba, you're disconnected. I think we just need to have you turn the cam off, but not disconnect anything, because now I can't put you back in the studio. But he does exemplify what it means to be a guerrilla intellectual, in the sense that as I would understand it, at least, that whether officially in the academy or not, he was putting together analyses, resources, sources, and tackling a particular topic that has not been welcomed into the mainstream of academia by any means, or even within Black public sphere spaces, to the certain extent that I think in both ways Kondo challenged the state's narrative and the narrative of the Nation of Islam. And I think in each way, my assessment would be it created a sort of a marginalization of his work, or an attempt to marginalize his work. There we go. I think we got you there. I think that should do it. There you go. Now we should be able to hear you, Baba Zak, and you can. Yeah, perfect. There you go.
Okay.
Go right on.
Can y'all hear me? Okay.
Absolutely.
Sound great now.
Where did I leave off?
You on the bus.
Yep, right.
You're on the bus reading Malcolm for the third time.
Okay. So anyway, Malcolm introduced me from Malcolm. Malcolm was the beginning of my journey into the history of my people. And from Malcolm, I read I read Garvey, all of Garvey's books. I read all of Malcolm's. Anything that was out there on Malcolm, I found it. I read it. I read Du Bois, for the first time, somebody who I was never taught about or anything like that. I even remember J.A. Rogers, because Malcolm mentioned him one time, and I found J.A. Rogers. I don't remember much about what I read about him, though. But the point is that Malcolm became, for me, my introduction to the history of African people. And then in the chapter that dealt with his travels, on the continent, I was introduced to the Nkrumahs and the Kenyatas and the Sekou Touré's and all of them as well. So he also introduced me to the history of Africans on the continent as well. So I continued my studies. I developed a reputation early as a radical, as a militant. They used the word militant in those days, so I was always the militant. When I was in high school, white people had a narrative about me that I hated all white people. I don't know, but at any rate, and for African students, I was the militant, but I also was the person to go to if you had questions about our history. So that was pretty much the role that I played. I went to college, and any opportunity, for a paper, for a research project, I would do it on Malcolm. So I was expanding, different variables about Malcolm, different factors about Malcolm along the way. Same thing with Garvey. Oh, and the Black Panthers as well. I was studying the Black Panthers. I read Huey P. Newton, early on. I read Angela Davis, all of them in the seventh grade. So by the time that I was in college, I was also the go-to person for anybody who wanted information about, our history and everything. So that's been a role, basically that I've played. Anyway, let me fast forward. My senior year in college is when I really got, committed to studying Malcolm's assassination. I had read an article by, this white leftist named Eric Norden that was published in the 1967 Realist magazine. And the title was something like "Who Killed Malcolm X?" And basically it was conspiratorial interpretation. And I read it and I was intrigued by it. And then from that point forward, I started by my second semester of my senior year.
I'm sorry to cut you off, Baba Zak. I'm sorry to cut you off, but what if you remember, what was it that was conspiratorial about that piece? What was it that, do you remember what the basic argument was of that piece?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Right. Yeah, no problem. What he was basically arguing was that the United States government, his argument though, I think was CIA. And he was arguing that one of the things that intrigued me in that article, and then he later republished, and maybe he revised it a little bit in Penthouse, maybe in, 1980 or something like that. But anyway, one of the things that he talked about was that he became interested in Malcolm's assassination because he was talking to a diplomat from from Africa. And the diplomat from Africa told him, that when Malcolm was coming to his country, he never identified, which country, but apparently it was the so-called Francophone, African country, the French colonized. And he said that when he talked to this, diplomat told him that one of the reasons that Malcolm was denied entrance into France on February 9th, 1965, was because the French Department of Alien Documentation and Counter-Espionage, which was then the French CIA, had intercepted information that the CIA was going to hit Malcolm, and they didn't want it to happen in France. So according to what Norden learned, so that piqued my curiosity as well. It's like, okay, wow. So all that to say that, I read this article, and, previously, I've read what everybody else had read. There were questions already in my mind because I remember I read the book that John Henry Clark edited, Malcolm X, the Man and His Times. And in that particular book, it consisted of writers, different writers talking about different aspects of Malcolm. And one of the people was Earl Grant. And Earl Grant wrote an article called The Last Days of Malcolm X. And he raised questions about the NYPD and their strange behavior leading up to and on the day of and then after the assassination of Malcolm X. So I'm kind of getting it now from different angles. I got the CIA over here, which brings in the United States government. Then over here, there are questions about the peculiar role of the NYPD. And then I guess ultimately, Norden mentioned the FBI as well. And then ultimately I brought in the FBI. Don't remember anybody in particular who was focusing on the FBI, but so all of this, what it did for me was it created questions. And so the main question for me was, okay, we know what the official version was, that the Nation of Islam killed him, but now my mind is entertaining other possibilities. So when I went to grad school, the next semester, I graduated, went to graduate school, I decided that I wanted to do my thesis on the assassination of Malcolm X. And so I remember the second semester in my first year of grad school, I wrote a paper. I still remember that paper. I wish I still had the paper. It was about 37 pages long, and it dealt with the assassination of Malcolm X and primarily talking about the role of the enemy, the role of boss. Basically, I built on the Norden and the Earl Grant paper, basically. And, I ended up ultimately writing a thesis on that a few years later. Now, the watershed for me was around 1983, there was a conference. There was the National Black Council for Black Studies conference in Chicago. And myself and then two other brothers, at the college, we went, to this conference in Chicago, and we drove, and that was quite an adventure as well. So anyway, at this conference, I'm basically for the first time meeting a lot of serious African scholars from primarily from the United States. And I'm telling them, those, who would listen, that, I'm a grad student at the University of blah, blah, blah. And I'm studying the assassination of Malcolm X. And they were excited. Everyone that I talked to, they were excited that I was taking on this task, so they offered to support me. I still remember at one stage, there was a line of African scholars, waiting. And I'm 21 years old, 22 years old. I'm in line, there's a line of African scholars waiting to talk to me, to give me information about Malcolm X, people to contact, people, places to go and stuff like that. And the New York group were particularly helpful. Leonard Jeffries, for example, gave me, phone numbers and people to call. Like Gil Noble, Ella Collins, Malcolm's, sister, and just different people like that. I talked to James Turner, who
rest in power. Yes,
yeah,
sir.
Yeah. Oh, I love that brother, man. He was just, and he was so cool and calm and collected. And he would just sit there and he would say, okay, write down this name. Da 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 da. Okay, I have to get you the phone number. But it was like he gave me several people that I needed to talk to. And I'm
sorry to interrupt again, but was there anything that they were saying to you at the time that you remember in terms of like, was there an excitement around, we were waiting for somebody to do this research or was there any of that happening at that moment?
Yeah, because you had some heavy hitters with you. I'm talking about
exactly.
You mentioned Gil Noble and Jeffries and Turner. I mean, Ella Collins. I mean, they were sound like they was stacking it up for you.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's why, because they were excited. Because one of the things that I remember being said is that nobody had seriously, I guess no African anyway, had seriously attempted to go after this particular topic for, and for political reasons, obviously, there were challenges, it's a very controversial topic, it involved, the Nation of Islam and, whether or not their hands were dirty. So people were careful. Now, keep this in mind, I'm in the company primarily, because Baraka was there as well. I didn't talk to Baraka. Karanga was there. I did talk to Karanga. And basically, with a few exceptions, it was a Pan-African, group. It was a Black nationalist group. And here and there were some Marxists as well. So we're talking about a very specialized, politically, socially, economically, we're talking about a very specialized class of people. And the common denominator is that all of them basically appreciated the work and the labor and the life of Malcolm X. So that was the common denominator. All I got was support. Now, there were some security. For the first time, I got some security concerns as well. And then whenever I would reach out to Ella or to other people, they would raise the question to me. And their whole thing to me was, you need to be careful because what you're doing, and this is what I came to understand that they were talking about. They were talking about the enemy over here, meaning the intelligence community. And they also wanted me to be careful of the Nation of Islam as well, because some of them, particularly those from New York, they knew that the nation was involved. So they were basically just telling me, watch your back. What you're doing is important. What you're doing, our people need, but you need to be careful. And then I learned this story, and I know I was on Carl Nelson's show some months back, and I don't think I got a chance to finish the story. So let me tell this story.
Great place to finish it and start it, by the way.
Okay. They told me, and I probably heard this 5 times. And in fact, Ella, I think, told me first, and then she would tell other people to remind me of this story. So, she had a real security concern for me. And what the story basically is that they said that when they started doing the commemorations at the Ferncliff Cemetery, there was a young brother. He was 17, from what I recall, and he was at one of the early commemorations, and they said they let him speak, and he talked about how Malcolm had impacted his life and everything. And then they said he pulled out a silver bullet, and he put it on Malcolm's, heads, it's in the ground, but his headstone thing. And he said that he would never he said that he would never rest. He vowed that he would never rest until Malcolm's true killers were found. And then they said that maybe, memories not as great as it used to be, but maybe a few months later or so, something like that. It wasn't a year, but they said that they found this brother with a bullet in his head. And so apparently for people like Ella, they connected the dots. And their thing was, it was probably because across the water, even though, again, at this stage of the game, I don't know, that there are people across the water, and we're talking about Newark, Newark Mosque number 25, where the killers are coming from. So I don't know this yet, but Ella apparently had some inklings of that. And so this is what she wanted people to tell me, people that she recommended that I talked to, like, for example, I talked to James Smalls, who had been one of her aides. And, I heard this story again. And with other people, I heard this story. So all of that, what it did for me, it meant that when I did some of my research trips to like New York, excuse me, when I did my research trips to places like New York, I was probably a little overly sensitive. I still remember talking to Gil Noble one time over the telephone when I was in New York. And he was telling me then, just kind of like watch yourself, young brother, be careful. What you're doing is important, but it's also dangerous. And we don't want you to be, to be naive. We don't want you to be stupid and not realize that you need to be careful. And I don't know to what extent, he knew anything about, some of the same thing with the whole Newark thing. That at that point, remember, I don't know that Newark has played a role in any of this stuff. So I'm just still kind of going my way. So at any rate, I continued, doing my research, and every opportunity I get a name for somebody else. I talked to a lot of people. Some had information for me, some didn't, but that's, it's hit and it's misses, but that's research. And we all know that. And then ultimately I wrote my thesis. I think it's still probably, I don't know, because I don't keep in touch with that school, but I think it's the most controversial thesis in that school's, probably ever written at that school. I don't know it for a fact. In those days, though, my thesis was primarily, I went with the second man arrested thesis that the NYPD selected someone, and this guy was an agent, and that basically, who had infiltrated the Nation of Islam, and that that the government, the NYPD, helping the United States government, killed Malcolm X. I began to delve into FBI documents, for this, and I made a few trips from, the school in Virginia to the, FBI office, and I would go through, thousands of pages. Started messing up my eyesight, because one of the things that I wouldn't do is, when you get tired, you can't still go through files. And I would do it, because they would give you in those days, they would give you, 49 free copies that they would copy in the place for you each time. And so I would always get my copy so I could take them home with me. And when you get tired, you got to learn how to stop. And I didn't. And I used to have 20/20, then my eyes started going and stuff like that. But at any rate, I guess you could say I became obsessed, with trying to find out who was responsible for the assassination of Malcolm X. Now, I also should make this point too. I've made it in the past and haven't talked about it much lately. But when I began my journey, one of the motivating factors for me was I wanted to basically, exonerate the nation from Malcolm's assassination, because I looked at it from this standpoint. I said that there is no way in hell that the nation under Elijah Muhammad could have killed Malcolm X. And so I kind of convinced myself that was an impossibility. So that meant that it had to be the external forces that I had already been studying anyway. It had to be the NYPD and their, counterintelligence unit, BALSI. It had to be the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It had to be the Central Intelligence Agency. So that was my premise, and even as I wrote my thesis, that was my premise. It's after that, like if you read my thesis right now, at that school, 180, 78 pages, something like that. It's the United States government with the NYPD that killed Malcolm X, basically. But ultimately, as I started probing more and more and started, talking to more and more people, it started to become clear that I had simplified the assassination of Malcolm X, that it wasn't just the enemy, that there were some other parts. And then ultimately, the research and the facts took me, to the Nation of Islam. And I had to look at the Nation of Islam. And so I began to look at the Nation of Islam. By the time I was in the 80s, the late 80s, I was looking at the Nation. I was looking at the Central Intelligence Agency. I was looking at the NYPD.
Zach, was there? I'm sorry to jump in again. Was there something in particular when that transition from the state to the nation? Was there something in particular? Do you remember? Was there like one bit of evidence you came across, or one argument you came across, or that started that?
It was a couple things.
I was going to ask the same thing, because just listening to it, it almost, if it was on television or a movie, it's like a murder mystery. You know what I'm saying? And I know you mentioned BALSI a couple of times, and for our audience who aren't familiar with BALSI, BOSS is the Bureau of Special Services, which was a special unit of the NYPD, also known as the Red Squad. Now, real quick, Gene Roberts was one of the quote unquote bodyguards who was an undercover agent inside of the ballroom when Malcolm was assassinated. He also infiltrated the Black Panther Party in New York, and he was basically outed once. He had to take, he was one of the undercover cops that they were, undercover agents that they called to the stand in the Panther 21 case so that's when it became known that he was an actual agent. But yeah, how did you, to Jared's point, how did you come to this conclusion? Because for folks that's listening, it sounds like, it's like eeny, meeny, miny, mo.
Right.
Right.
So let's hear that.
Okay. Yeah. There were a couple factors involved here. One, Peter Goldman, who in 1972 he published, The Death and Life of Malcolm X, and then in 1979 he went into the prisons and he interviewed Talmadge Hare, who was one of the convicted assassins. He interviewed Norman 3X Butler. He interviewed Thomas 15X Johnson, the other two men who were, serving, time for Malcolm's assassination. And he had concluded that Hare, that obviously that Hare had killed him, but he also concluded that Johnson and Butler had not. But more significantly, Hare had submitted an affidavit starting in actually he ended up doing two, but in 1977 he submitted an affidavit in which he admitted his own role in Malcolm's assassination and said he was a member of the nation and he was the person who fingered the Newark Mosque. So that's one of the things that got me on to the Newark Mosque, between Hare's affidavit first, and then Peter Goldman, concluding, his conclusions did impact how I was looking at things as well. And then this is also significant. Remember now, I'm also interviewing former Muslims, and former Muslims are telling me, and of course these are people who are no longer in the nation, but they were in the nation when Malcolm, was alive, or they came in right after he was killed, and they're also telling me that basically within the nation, it wasn't necessarily a secret that the mosque, the Newark Mosque, took out Malcolm. So all of these forced me now to start looking at the nation. And then over time, I started interviewing, like, for example, I think another important interview for me was I was invited to Detroit by my brother, Paul Lee, who, in my opinion, is the foremost, student on the, Malcolm X. And he invited me to Detroit, and I spent maybe about 3 or 4 days there. And one of the people that I was able to interview while I was there was Wilfred Little, one of Malcolm's oldest brothers. And remember, he had been in the nation until 1968. And, the interview with him was also a watershed, because he was telling me some inside stuff that ministers, and FOI people would know, but that the average person wouldn't know. And of course, one of the things that he talked about was Elijah Muhammad, and and some of the things that Elijah Muhammad would say, when he was just talking to ministers, in different conferences and stuff. And he told me something one day that really struck me when I was interviewing him. He couldn't remember the conference, where this was said, but he said that Elijah Muhammad said that he hoped to see Malcolm's children, Malcolm's family, basically begging for bread in the street. And so that struck me, and it really forced me to start looking more at Elijah Muhammad. Now, in the end, and for the most part, this is what I generally argued in the first edition of my book, which, by the way, I'm working on the second edition. People are, saying, when's it coming out and all that. I'm still basically, I'm still working on it. I've added 10 chapters to it. I've added, the original one had 1,200 and maybe 70 endnotes. This one will have almost 1,900 endnotes. So I'm still doing research. I don't have graduate assistants like Marable and other, people at these, big white schools have. So I'm doing it all basically myself, even as a teacher, and you know, still have responsibilities and stuff to my family. But one of the things that I talked about in the original Malcolm X, you know, was this notion, you know, I was still struggling with Elijah Muhammad, you know, and whether or not he directly ordered it or indirectly ordered it. And initially, my position was that he indirectly ordered it through the newspapers, you know, articles that he would write, and then these conferences that he would have. But then I talked to Warith D. Muhammad, Elijah Muhammad's son, Wallace. And Wallace, you know, told me some stories that, you know, he was involved in conversations he had with his father. And so that really convinced me that Elijah Muhammad, you know, really was the person, you know, who was directing the nation's movement, you know, basically the war chest against Malcolm. And then I talked to some other people. The only challenge that I've had, though, is that most of the people who I talked to from the nation would only talk to me if I agreed to not mention their names. And, you know, that was one of the things that I don't like. I understood it, but, you know, you want people to basically, you know, give their names so that you can have that credibility, you know, of who they are and what have you. Now, one good thing, though, is that Wilford told me that he would prefer that I not use his names when it came to certain things, but that once he made transition, you know, he gave me permission to use his name. So in this coming edition, I don't have to say a confidential source. I could actually say Wilford told me this. I had one other person that kind of said the same thing. But at any rate, the more research I did, the more clear it became that, you know, that it was Elijah Muhammad was basically, you know, he was in charge of, you know, of organizing the nation's part in Malcolm's assassination.
So, question, because of course, you know, again, I interviewed you last year, and you mentioned Paul Lee and Peter Goldman. I interviewed them two together, and you all are saying the same thing when it comes to, you know, saying that it was Elijah Muhammad. Do you believe that there were agents in the nation responsible, or are you saying that these are straight up rank and file members of the nation that were carrying out orders? Is that what are you saying, just for clarity?
Okay, I appreciate the question. This is what I found so far. Okay, we know that basically there was a 5-man murder team in the Audubon on February 21st, 1965. Okay, we know that. And we can identify 4 of them. We can identify. The 5th one has been very difficult to identify. We know, for example, Talmadge Hare, who ended up doing, you know, time in prison. I think he got out maybe around 2010, something like that. We know Benjamin Thomas, who I was able to get a obituary of him. I was able to trace him to Apopka, Florida, where he was killed. And that was October the 28th, 1986. He was killed in Apopka, Florida, which is not far from Orlando. So we can account for him. Leon Davis just died last year. I was able to get an obituary from, you know, for him. And so we can account for him. He's the one that fired the 38. And then, of course, most people know that Willie Bradley, he died, I guess it was November 2000 and maybe 20 or so, in Newark. And we can account for him. He's the one that delivered the kill shot. He's the one that delivered a J.C. Higgins 12-gauge double-barrel sawed-off shotgun into Malcolm's chest and torso, which blew a 7-inch, you know, diameter hole in Malcolm's chest and, you know, stomach, which ultimately killed Malcolm. So we can account for them. I was able to get his FBI file. We know, for example, that he was in the he was a former Marine. Like one of the questions that I raised in my first edition was, how did a brother from the Newark, New Jersey area know how to use a shotgun with the skills that this guy demonstrated on February 21st? Because he shot from the hip. Shotguns are very difficult to use, but for people who know what they're doing, you shoot from the hip, and you got to hold it a certain way and a certain amount of velocity over here, all of that stuff. This guy did it, like a skilled pro. So one of the questions that I did raise in my first edition was the possibility, could that have been an indication that maybe there was intelligence, that there was an intelligence apparatus. Maybe he was involved in an intelligence apparatus. I'm just raising the questions and stuff. But in the end, what we know now, the fifth person is the one who we just, it's almost like he was a ghost. Now, part of the problem is Hare, when he issued his affidavits, he wasn't sure, the name thing wasn't as sure as it was with the other ones. He said his name was Wilbur, maybe Kinley or McKinley. It's like he wasn't sure. So obviously that makes it difficult to develop a paper trail when you're not even sure what the person's name was. All Hare said about him was that he had he owned the 64 Chevrolet that they drove to the Audubon in. He was the oldest member of the Assassination team. And Hare said that he also owned a construction company in the Newark area, and he did stuff around the mosque. Well, one of the things, I once spent about a day, just kind of, using the limited sources that we have for something like this. But I spent a day, decades ago, going through the phone books in the Newark area, hoping maybe that it's possible that this guy could have advertised. I went through the phone book looking for the different variations of his name, just hoping. Because see, here's the thing. In those days, the way that the phone books worked, they would give you the person's name, they would give you the person's address, and they would even tell you where the person worked, or the general area. Like, for example, if you go back to the 1964 Patterson, I think it's Patterson and Posaic, if I remember it. But if you go back to their phone book, and I had to do this at the Library of Congress, and you pull up, I found Ben Thomas in this phone book, and it told you he worked in Hackensack as a machine, some factory or something. I think it was paper, as a machine worker or something. I mean, it told you that. So I was hoping that I might look up and get some information about McKinley or Kinley or whatever the hell his name was. But he was the only one that I wasn't able to really identify. Now, here's the thing, though. I bring this up to make this point. And this is, goes back to your question, Kalanji. The possibility now of the four that I just talked about, I have no doubt in my mind they were all true believers. The fifth one, if there was any type of an asset, an FBI asset or what have you, maybe possibly McKinley. And I'm only saying this based on this point. If you study how the enemy would use assets historically, okay? We have those cases in which an asset might do the enemy's job for them, and then they basically move on somewhere else. They put them up somewhere else, or they basically just kind of like disappear. They move on or what have you and stuff. And I'm just wondering, and I'm just thinking out loud that could McKinley have been somehow affiliated with the intelligence community somehow, FBI maybe. It's all possible. But here's the thing, though. Even if he was, it makes no damn difference whatsoever. It would mean nothing as far as the nation's role in Malcolm's assassination. Because, that's one of the arguments that they've been trying to put out, that they were, I think the latest that they say now is that all of them were not none of them were in good standing during the assassination. So yeah, they came out of mosque number 25. Nobody seems to be denying that, but none of them were in good standing. They were all basically in hiatus or kicked out or suspended or something like that. I mean, come on. But the truth of the matter is that even if they were all agents, it wouldn't mean anything in the larger scheme of things, because go back, read Muhammad Speaks. Read the atmosphere that Elijah Muhammad and his high command, read the atmosphere that they created within the Nation of Islam to go after Malcolm. Read the language that they used to go after Malcolm. Listen to some of the old speeches. Like, for example, Elijah Muhammad gave a speech in June of 1964 in which he basically stated that, he wanted to see Malcolm blasted from the face of the earth. When you start looking at all of these things, then it's real clear that Malcolm's assassination came from the top, Elijah Muhammad. We can play games. We can make up shit. We can act as though, the nation is a victim. The nation was not a victim in Malcolm's case. The nation was basically the predators. The nation were the killers.
Baba Zak, if I could, and to borrow from Kalanji's play Cracker's Advocate here for a quick second, to what extent, though, could we argue, or could it be argued, that even the conclusions that you're saying were reached by Elijah Muhammad were themselves inspired or driven by infiltration? In other words, could Elijah have been pushed to reach those conclusions by state intervention? And to what extent would you then, again, not to say that the nation is innocent or whatever, but to maybe add some more complication to their complicity.
Okay, no, I appreciate the question. First off, let's be real clear. If you read my first book, and I add more in the second, in the revised version, my argument is that the enemy, the FBI in particular, they had a disruption plan within the Nation of Islam. And they're going to play a very important part, by the way, in distancing Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad, and Malcolm and the national leadership, and Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad's family. They're going to do, technically they're going to do a textbook, a job doing that, and the way that they were able to do it is, keep this in mind, they have phone taps on Elijah Muhammad's phone. They got phone taps on Malcolm's phone. They got phone taps on the national headquarters phone. And Elijah Muhammad has a home in Arizona. They got phone taps on that. What they're able to do, and I'll talk about this in detail, what the FBI was able to do was they would listen to conversations, and keep this in mind, they've also infiltrated all of the mosques. They have infiltrated all of the mosques. So they got assets who are constantly reporting to them, telling them things that are happening in meetings of the FOI, meetings of the MGT, general body meetings, telling them what's happening in conferences, Savior's Day and other things like that, socials that they might have. They're telling them, they are reporting back and forth. But this is what the enemy is doing. What they're doing is they're taking this intelligence, they're taking this information, and they're seeing how Elijah Muhammad reacts, how Raymond Sharif, the supreme captain of the Fruit of Islam, how he reacts. They want to know where the weaknesses are in the relationship, for example, between Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad. And when people call up Elijah Muhammad, say, for example, complaining about Malcolm, which happened a lot, I should say, what they want to know is, where are the pressure points? What issues are Elijah Muhammad reacting to the most, the worst? Where is there the most tension? This is what the FBI is looking for. And keep this in mind, y'all. When you talk about the counterintelligence of the FBI, you're talking about a different sort of universe that the average person would be shocked to understand, to know. Because you're talking about people, basically, this is their job. Their job is to figure out ways to destroy their targets. And if it means lying, cheating, stealing, they have no problem with that. If it means destroying somebody's family life, they have no problems with that. If it means destroying someone's relationships with their community, they have no problems with that. So this is the mentality that we're dealing with in 1963, 1964, 1965, as far as Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam is
2023.
concerned.
Yeah, 2023. Yeah,
2023.
2024, 2025. Yeah. On the real.
But let me finish this point, though, Bobbers. Let me finish this point.
Cool.
And so what's happening here is they're taking notes. So what I determined is that there were certain pressure points that the FBI realized they could use the most. They realized, for example, that the age difference between Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad was a point of tension for Elijah Muhammad. They realized that Malcolm, that the media and the press constantly being obsessed with Malcolm, that was a point of contention. They also realized that the whole secession question, who's going to take over when Elijah Muhammad retires or dies, that was a problem for Elijah Muhammad on different levels. It was a problem because his family was putting pressure on him to name one of them early on, so that if he died unexpectedly or something, there wouldn't be, Malcolm could not be part of the equation, So that was a special point for Elijah Muhammad. Another point of tension for Elijah Muhammad was Malcolm trying to push the Nation of Islam to a more political, position, trying to push the Nation of Islam to participate more in struggle, in African struggle. Like Malcolm, for example, organized, this was in 63, he wanted to do this Black Unity Conference and stuff. And Elijah Muhammad, if you read, the phone taps and stuff, is saying, but Malcolm, we are a religious organization. I don't like this political stuff. We're not a civil rights organization. Ultimately, he let Malcolm do it. But my point is that they realize the enemy is listening to these conversations, and they're realizing that this is a point of tension, because afterwards, Elijah Muhammad might call somebody else up or talk to somebody else on the phone, and he will say something about, Malcolm's trying to push us here. Malcolm's trying to push us there. I've been trying to tell him we are a religious organization. We're not a political organization. And then the enemy will come after us more if we become more political. They're privy. The enemy is privy to all of these types of conversation. So what they're doing is they're taking notes. They're saying, we got a rise from Elijah Muhammad when they said this about Malcolm. We didn't get a rise when they said that about Malcolm. So this is what the enemy would then do. They're gathering this intelligence, and then they do a couple things. Within the FBI, there was a concept known as bad jacketing. Bad jacketing means that the FBI would create a false rumor. Sometimes it can be true, but basically what they would do is they would get their informants to promote some type of rumor that they wanted them to circulate, start telling people and then other people start hearing it, and then they take it, and then they start telling, let nature take its course once you put it out there. So what they would do is they would create bad jacketing, and they didn't do this just for the nation. They did this for everybody. They would do a bad jacket on those areas that Elijah Muhammad was sensitive to. Malcolm's trying to take over. Malcolm wants to make the nation more political. Malcolm is media hungry. He always got to go before the cameras. All these types of things. And so these things, they start to get circulated within the nation. And of course, Elijah Muhammad's family, who basically they really hate Malcolm because they view Malcolm as a threat. They will pick up some of this stuff, add stuff to it, make up stuff themselves. Why? Because they want to influence how their father, is, how he's dealing with Malcolm. Because why? They themselves, forget the enemy. Elijah Muhammad's family wants to create a schism, a split between Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad. So in many ways, the family is going to serve as assets for the enemy as well. Why? Because it's in their vested interest for Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm to basically have a parting of the ways. And that way Malcolm won't be the threat, that they view him as. And so all of this is leading up to some other tactics that the FBI will use to help split up Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad. The FBI,
No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Go ahead. The FBI, they developed a mechanism in which they would use the media to promote their ideals. And what they did was they would identify certain journalists and reporters. They would put them on the FBI's payroll. And whenever the FBI needed these journalists to do an article on something, or in some cases, the FBI would write an article that has all of the stuff in it that the FBI wants to promote. And then what they would do is they would then give it to what they call certified friends of the FBI. That's what they call these journalists and reporters. They would give it to these certified friends, and these certified friends had the option to either print it, publish it in their newspapers or magazines or whatever, saying, word for word what the FBI, wrote, or they could edit it and modify it, but still make those very same points. Or in some cases, the journalist or reporter might decide, I got the gist, I get the main points. I'm going to rewrite this myself because nobody's going to believe that that's coming from me. So the point is that one of the other things that the FBI would do, and they would do this with Chicago newspapers, they would do it with New York newspapers in particular, they would do it with New Jersey newspapers. They would then have articles published that would promote some of these very same points that would create tension between Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X. So all of these things the enemy is doing behind the scenes. Malcolm doesn't know this is going on, although, he may have had some suspicions. Elijah Muhammad doesn't know this is going on, but the enemy is behind the scenes. They're conducting what they called a disruption campaign. We're going to later know it as just part of the counterintelligence program. But this disruption plan that the enemy was doing to Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad was designed to basically create more and more distance between Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad. Now, here's the key to all of this. In the end, the enemy is going to get what they wanted. So that's clear. We see that. But here's the thing, though. The only way that they were able to help create that schism between Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad was because Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad gave the enemy ammunition. In other words, if they didn't know that Elijah Muhammad, had issues around Malcolm's age, issues around Malcolm's publicity, issues around Malcolm's politics, and all these other things, they could not have exploited it. They exploited it because these tensions already existed, in a more, subtle way. They already existed in a more covert way. All the enemy did simply was to exploit those tensions.
You mentioned bad jacketing, which is also known as snitch jacketing. That's something that they did to Kwame Ture, then Stokely Carmichael. One of the things that the FBI did was they created a letter, and they placed it inside of one of his comrades' cars, basically saying that he was a CIA informant, and it was a communique between him and the CIA. But I'm pointing that out because it's not only just the rumor mongering, but it's the manufacturing of evidence as well, right?
Right. One corrective, Bob. Bad jacketing and snitch jacketing are cousins, but they're not the same. Snitch jacketing basically means that the rumor that they're going to put out is that the person is a snitch, either for an agency or police or something like that. Bad jacketing simply means that they're putting out negative information about the person to then circulate. But a snitch jacket specifically means we're saying Stokely Carmichael is a snitch. And by the way, one of the tragedies of all of that is that, remember, Stokely Carmichael had been the prime minister, which was an honorary position, but he was the prime minister of the Black Panther Party. Right. And based on this counterintelligence tactic that they used against him, Huey P. Newton will ultimately, and again, this worked also because they also realized there was tension between Huey P. Newton and Stokely Carmichael anyway. And ultimately, Huey P. Newton is going to ultimately excommunicate Stokely Carmichael out of the Black Panther Party, and he's going to give a public reason for it, saying, we hereby declare Stokely Carmichael a CIA agent, which meant that very same operation that you just referenced ultimately was used to create a schism, or no, not create, to basically exploit a schism between Stokely Carmichael and the Black Panther Party leadership. Okay.
Right.
Are you right, Bob?
No. So yeah, and to your point, even with that, I think that I know that you had put out on the cover of the paper about the Ruba, I believe it was who else was that they were calling them enemies of the state as well. My brain's a little foggy right now.
The whole East Coast.
Yeah.
Basically. Yeah. So, but my point, one of the things that you raised, Baba, you was talking about they aided the state for, not to paraphrase what you're saying, they aided the state by highlighting their contradictions, their disagreements, and their weaknesses, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And it was virtually impossible not to, seeing that, as you stated, there were agents sprinkled within the organization itself. So it was infested, for lack of better words. So it just seems like, I don't know, how could that have possibly been prevented in your eyes? And I know it's just just me thinking out loud, right?
I got you, Bob. I can give you one example. There's a brother out of Newport News. I'm from Newport News, and I guess he was New York first. His name is Baba Khalifa. Baba Khalifa. I haven't been in touch with him for like 30 years or so, but I would talk to him from time to time because he used to be in the nation. And they created an organization of serious brothers, paramilitary and everything. And one of the things that they did, and I'm not saying, this is just one example of how to prevent the enemy from doing its dirt on us. What they did was they created an organization. And I think if memory serves me, now remember, this is 30, 40 years ago. If memory serves me, they would not accept, they had their cadres, they would not accept new members for something like 10 years. And their logic was that everybody knew everybody. Some of them grew up together. They could account for everybody. And their notion was that if they accept people now, the enemy could infiltrate. But right now they can account for everybody. Well, that's one extreme. That's one way. And I'm sure that organization probably never had to deal, with the enemy sending in. Because the only way that they could have done it would have been to have turned to people who are already in there. But because these people and stuff, you've kind of reduced, that possibility. So I'm saying that to say that's one example. But to answer your question more directly, it's very difficult because this is the problem that the Panthers had. Hell, this is the problem that Garvey had in the 1920s, in the 19-teens. That the enemy
right now, I'm sure.
Exactly. And so the point is that it is a very challenging, problem. What I would suggest, though, that you do tighten up certain things would make it more difficult because in many ways, I guess we could make an argument that you probably cannot totally 100%, prevent, especially if you're an organization that's seeking to grow, that's seeking to use membership to make a dent in struggle or something like that. So you can't just cut off all your things, but certainly we need to thoroughly investigate people as much as we can. And I think we need to also promote political education, constantly, political education constantly. One of the mistakes that we made in the Garvey movement, we made that, in most of the Black nationalist movement, is that we wouldn't do the political education, as much as we needed to do, and hope that the more you do it, the more it would put in people's minds, commitment, and an understanding of struggle. And then the other thing is we need to also regularly, provide different tests, to make sure that people are not in the, in the up and up. To me, these are just superficial things. Obviously, much more thorough analysis needs to be done because one of the tragedies, and we've seen this constantly, under the counterintelligence program, and like y'all saying, certainly today, is this notion that, the enemy right now, they can pretty much damn near infiltrate any serious organization that we got, unless, like I said, we cut off membership. But, it's difficult to cut off membership because there's strength in numbers. So we want the numbers, but we're going to have to be sensitive. Mm-hmm.
No, you're right on point because that's we get folks with our organization all the time asking how can they join, and the response is come through when we're working and do the work. You know what I mean? Because the reality is there's no open membership, and political education is key because indeed, the one thing that I'm grateful for within our organization, the FTP movement, is that we build cadre and we build families, so we know each other. You know what I mean? So when when the baby's born, we're going to check out, the newborn. There's a graduation. Okay, boom, such and such is graduating. We literally watch our children grow together, right? So it's a little more difficult when you're Uncle Zak, and now you're up on the stand because now you have to look the babies in their eyes. You know what I mean? Yeah. Now it's a whole nother level. So indeed, I why I dig what you're saying about the whole strength in numbers. I think there's more strength in politicized loyal numbers, because there's always room for failure when you have more. Sometimes less is more. So definitely I appreciate what you had to say on that level, because folks get caught up in numbers only. And Jared to tell you, like, my first thing is, okay, boom, besides political education, what's the security looking like?
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
exactly.
If you're not concerned about security, any situation can be an Audubon ballroom. Any situation. And there's no room for
You're right.
nobody's thinking about us. If you think like one of the things, and I'm gonna shut up, one of the things that Stokely said, or Kwame Ture said, he said, if I'm fighting my enemy and my enemy is not fighting me, then what am I doing wrong? If I'm chasing my enemy's not chasing me, then I'm not doing anything.
Exactly.
And that's the reality of it. But I'm sorry, go ahead, Bob. Jared,
well, if I could, we have one question from an audience member, if I could raise that,
Sure.
Because I know, unfortunately, our time is a little bit short this morning, and we definitely will have to have you back on to talk more about all of these details. And as your updated edition gets ready to come out, we definitely want to be involved with that. But Martin Barrios asks, first says, peace, would love to ask Baba Zak Kondo his thoughts on the footage that appears to show a man wearing a fedora and a tweed coat outside the ballroom, who is speculated to be Norman Butler. Carl Evans and several other researchers believe that that is Butler, and would also love to know the status of his updated book. Thank you, regards, Martin. And thank you, Martin, for watching. And Baba Zak.
Yeah. Appreciate it, brother. I looked at the footage as well and stuff. And, I let me make this point. I can see how, we need to seriously look at that and investigate that. So I appreciate, the Carl Evans of the world for, being sensitive to that. But when I looked at it, I didn't see Butler. But here's the other thing, though. Everything that we know tells us, that Butler, like, if you go through the trial transcript, which I had to do, courtesy of my brother, Paul Lee. I always got to give my props and stuff. He was able to secure me a copy of the trial transcript, all 36 or so 100 pages of it and stuff. And I read every page. But at any rate, he had credible witnesses, Butler did, in the trial that basically established his whereabouts, which was really his house. So as far as the tweed is concerned, if you kind of go back, the tweed during those days, it wasn't like it was a coat that people did not wear. And so I think that the problem is that we're going to need more, more than a coat and stuff. I'm real clear, based on my analysis, based on my research, I'm real clear that, and I want to make this point clear too, Butler and Johnson were not Sunday school teachers in all of this. Butler and Johnson, they beat the hell out of people who were viewed as enemies of the Nation of Islam. Okay. Butler was asked when he was in prison, if you were ordered to kill Malcolm, would you have done it, as a true believer? And he struggled to give Peter Goldman an answer, because that was his reputation. That was Johnson's reputation. I interviewed both of them, Johnson after the book came out, Butler before. And so we're not talking about Sunday school teachers. We're talking about hardcore members of the FOI who, whenever Joseph needed somebody's head cracked, he would turn to both of them and a few others. So I'm not here to say, that Butler is walking around with a halo on his head. He was, he was part of all of that. But did he kill Malcolm? Was he in the Audubon ballroom? If you look at the witnesses who testified against Butler, none of them were credible. There were holes in all of their testimony, all of them. Some of them even, grand jury testimony contradicted their trial testimony. None of them were credible. So this is my point. And this is the argument that I made in the first edition. It's the argument that I made. The evidence tells us that both Butler and Johnson were fall men. They were basically set up to take the fall for Malcolm's assassination, to connect the New York mosque to the assassination. And that's what the evidence says. Now, as far as to update you, as I was talking about this earlier, I'm hoping by the latest part of the spring to have my book, released. But I am still constantly doing work on it. I'm constantly, I'm still doing research, and I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I'm still doing research. But I'm at the end. I can see the light at the end of the tunnel. And one final point. I'm looking at this as my last, this will be my last opportunity right now to deal with a project that I've been working on for over 40 years. So I'm making sure that my T's are crossed and my I's are dotted, because I'm looking, to, what I don't do and whatever weaknesses that might be in this book, I'm going to pass to the next generation to correct my mistakes and my weaknesses.
Right on. Yeah.
No, thank you very much for that. So I think there were a couple other questions here that were mostly asking about where to find the first edition and when the second edition is coming out, which I think has been addressed. I don't know, Baba Zak, if there's more you wanted to say on that, that you feel like you haven't, or maybe you want to just state again about where they can get the first edition, and then the second.
The first edition, from what I could gather, they're basically sold out. If anybody has it, it would be everyone's place. But I would just suggest to you, don't worry about the first edition at this stage of the game, and just be on the lookout for the revised edition. It will be, in my opinion, a stronger presentation. It's going to be broader, and I'm going to be able to address issues that I did not address in the first one.
Right on. We do have a question from Omawale the Elder about why you might think, with all that has been said and that you've had to say about Elijah Muhammad and his family, or Minister Farrakhan, why were neither of them or any NOI official ever criminally implicated or charged in Malcolm's assassination? Yeah.
What I would suggest to you, and I actually do address this in the upcoming book as well. If Elijah Muhammad is, if he was basically, put on, put out there, okay, the FBI would have to expose the various resources that they used to obtain information. They would have to expose, about the nation and Elijah Muhammad and about the assassination. They would have to expose, just how entrenched they were involved in not just investigating Elijah and the nation, but in disrupting it and basically destroying it. Hoover in particular went out of his way. What he liked to do was to feed stuff, but not allow the FBI to be the source, because he was scared that it would expose the FBI to how vast the resources that they basically commanded. So no, they don't want Elijah Muhammad, because think about this, y'all. Most of the stuff that the evidence that the FBI has on the Nation of Islam was obtained illegally. They didn't go through no system to get phone taps and all of that. Hoover avoided all of those things, because remember, there's a system in place. In order for the FBI to get phone taps, they got to go to the Attorney General, who's going to investigate this and that and then make a decision. Hoover created a shortcut so that they never had to do it. And what they basically did was they never had to do it if, put it this way, if it was a live source, like an infiltration, they didn't have to go through those special, things. They had to jump through the hoops. But in order to get an electronic, they had to jump through hoops. So this is what Hoover did. He would basically put taps in wherever he wanted to put them. But when he identified the taps in their language, he would identify them as if they were a human source. And by being able to do that, Hoover was able to pretty much tap everybody from presidents all the way down to Sunday school teachers illegally. But the problem that they would run into, though, is that if you bring in the courts, now there's a case, it made it almost impossible for Hoover to use these illegal tactics, these illegal mechanisms to get people legitimately through the courts and stuff. And I'm putting legitimately in quotation marks, so we're clear. But it made it near impossible for Hoover and the FBI to be able to use their resources to go after their enemies on that level. So what they relied upon was, the old-fashioned, hey, what we will basically do is we'll just frame some people. So in a sense, this is what they basically did. They know that the nation is dirty as far as Malcolm's assassination. They know that there's blood on the nation's hands in 1965 with regard to Malcolm. So the best thing that they did, is they went to New York. They didn't have a problem going to New York. And let me make this point too. If Hare had not been captured, and this is an ahistorical point, y'all, because I can't support it because it never happened. If Hare was not arrested and charged, say he got away, say all of the Newark assassins got away, I will bet you money that all of the assassins that they would have arrested and charged and convicted would have been from Mos 7 in New York. Again, it's ahistorical. Why? Because all the FBI was interested in, all the NYPD was interested in, was basically having some members of the nation to take the fall. They didn't care that it had to be the right members. They didn't care that much. They just wanted to make sure that somebody from the nation basically, paid a price.
So thank you for that, Baba Zak. There's and again to a number of folks who are still asking about when and where to get the book. Zak has already answered that, so let's just solve and make it simple. Stay tuned to BPM, and as soon as the brother is ready, we will have the biggest rollout possible that he will allow for this next edition of the book, because we know. We have an idea, some of us at least, and more of us should, that how much work you put in and how important the work is. So we're very excited to support that.
Matter of fact, Jared, in my Kalanji type way, Baba Zak, forgive me, but when Baba Zak Kondo releases this book, we will the official first reading will be right here at Black Power Media.
I'm already agreeing.
I'll go ahead and call my man Paul Lee, and I know
let's do it.
I know that Paul can make it happen, so I don't know.
Let's do it.
Yeah,
I hear y'all, Bubba. I hear y'all. In fact,
sorry, go ahead. I was gonna say maybe we need to pony up and make this a live event. Let's anyway, let's. But
well.
Yeah,
let me say this, Bob. Let me say this. Y'all are my brothers, and I love y'all. I trust y'all. More importantly, I trust y'all, and so I'm open to doing whatever y'all want to do with that. So you can take that to the bank.
But it's interesting you said that, and I appreciate you saying that, because speaking of trust, Baba Kondo, I am very much interested, and I admit, sometimes I'm jokingly referred to as being a little petty, but
Not you.
not me, but but I am very much interested in what I think is the principal question around the way Malcolm and the research around his life has been carried out as of late. And there's been a number of documentaries. There's been a number of people making claims about their own contributions to this research, and maybe not, from my humble vantage point, properly appreciating your contributions or acknowledging where they've built on those contributions. I mean, we dealt with some of this in that collective response to the book attributed to Manning Marable, as I now like to describe it. But there's been Netflix documentaries. There's this, in other words, there's this constant reproduction of commentary around Malcolm and his assassination. And I'm just wondering if there's anything you would want to say about what you've seen happening, and if you are as concerned about it, perhaps, as I am.
Yeah, I'm definitely. I do have some concerns on a couple levels. First off, let me deal with that Netflix thing, which, again, and I've apologized several times, y'all. So I ain't gonna apologize.
No. Oh, we're not asking you to apologize.
No. I'm not talking to y'all, Baba. I'm
okay.
In general. And I think that has, like the Netflix, to me, has contributed to, to this environment that you're referring to, Baba. Because what it represents is, and I'm always frank. What the Netflix thing shows is that with the right connections, somebody who hasn't done very much research on Malcolm X can be anointed as a master researcher with instant credibility that people will now, place value in. No matter, how competent we're talking about, no matter how entrenched the person is as far as knowledge and research is concerned. And I think we should always, especially now, let me be clear. If we're talking about, some punk ass like George Washington or something like that, who cares? Right? Nobody give a damn about no bullshit like that. But we're talking about one of our own, somebody, who was, one of our finest. And so I think for that reason, there should be cause for concern, because in many ways, what it says to me is that our enemies, and I'm saying that mindful of who produced the film. Okay. And for people who don't know, Skip Gates produced the film. So when I say our enemies, I'm not mispronouncing my words. I think, I think there's a whole history there of someone who, in my opinion, has not had our best interests at heart, despite, some of the documentaries and things that, that he's put out. So my point is that we're in a situation in which people who don't necessarily have the best interests of our people at heart can put out narratives, and because of the medium that is being broadcast on, like Netflix, can basically control the narrative. They can basically promote the values and the ideals that the creators of the of the documentary, wants to basically put out there. And it don't have to be based on the historical reality. And that's my concern, is that people like Skip Gates can promote, their integrationist oriented values, because I'm scared. I think there's a second one coming out as to how Malcolm is going to be portrayed.
Another one? There's another one coming?
my understanding is that there should be another one. Now, is it on the assassination or is it on his life? I don't know. Because remember, I disconnected and made it known after I went through that I lose my number. So I'm not, I'm not in the loop and stuff. But that's my understanding, because that was being talked about when I was still in the loop. So like I said, I don't know. And but my concern is that I don't think that that there's a genuine interest in doing justice to Malcolm, and I think that's my major concern. About this whole new universe. With these.
And I think it's important. I'm sorry, but I think it's also important that you bring up that point, and particularly the point around Professor Gates, given the current controversy he's at the center of with this Black Studies curriculum.
Exactly.
So I think it's very important that you raise that point.
And the bottom line, Barbara, in relation to him, you can always expect him to take the position that's in the best interest of the enemy. It doesn't matter what it is, he's going to take that position. And that's what he's done, because my understanding is he's the one that kind of invited. Now, I could be wrong. He's the one that invited the so-called scholars who, well, I don't want to say so-called, because there's some decent people who participated in that project. But he's the person who basically selected the people. And so, he's the person who, when they need to compromise this project, that's who they go to say, hey, look, we need to compromise this project. We need you to support it. So can you make a statement? And then that guy will go and make the damn statement.
And I just want to say, sorry, Kalani, just real quick. I just want to say, for people who are just anyone who's not aware of some of this context, this fight, from my humble perspective, Gates won in the late 80s, early 90s in solidifying himself as the premier spokesperson for all of Black history and all of the academic public presentation of that history. So this has been an ongoing process that he is sort of at the culmination of, in terms of his career and his influence on all of this. So maybe at some point we'll come back and really get into that history here on this program, which I think would be great. But I just wanted to quickly say that. Sorry, Kalani.
Yeah. No. And I'm glad you said that, because we need to point out all of these Negroes who position themselves in that way. So you have the Skip Gates on that level, but then you have like the Al Sharpton when it comes to quote unquote criminal justice. Now you have the Benjamin Crumps. So there's always some Negro that positions himself as the go-to. I am the negotiator. It was Jesse in the 80s. You know what I mean? Making deals with Pepsi. So these are what these Negroes do. But the thing is, we have to consistently call them out, because what's happening right now, there are a younger generation, our age and younger, in the academy in particular right now, who are coming up, who are following that same blueprint. And we really have to rip that blueprint to shreds. And this is like what Baba was talking about earlier. The playbook that the FBI uses, the playbook that the police use, the playbook that the state uses, it's always revised. You know what I'm saying? Right. It's no need to rewrite it, because, we're going to go along with the same script. Like, folks aren't researching. Most of the people that respond to a Baba Zak Kondo, a Paul Lee, a Peter Goldman, and others, oftentimes it's reactionary. It's either reactionary or it's emotional. So the thing is, until we come with documentation, real hardcore documentation that can dispute what it is that's being said, then everything else is, it's cool. It's like, this is my guy, that's your guy. But many of us, we didn't get down with Malcolm because he left the nation. We give props to the nation for helping to bring him into some type of social consciousness, right? Bring him into some type of awareness, because there had to be a bridge from Detroit Red. And this is why we try to be patient as our man Kwame Ture would say, with our people, because of the fact that if we're not patient with our people, we'll miss out on a Malcolm X. We'll miss out on a George Jackson. Shit, you might miss out on a Kalonji Changa just being on BPM because and I'm not, for the record, I'm not comparing myself to them. I'm just saying that if you base folks on their beginnings, then you'll never get to see what the book is like.
Exactly. And that's true for all of us. If I could just add something else real quickly. This topic is also relevant. The whole, that whole Negro-dom universe, what we're talking about right now. I have a book that's going to be coming out this year as well. And it kind of addresses, those Negroes, and their danger to our struggle. The name of the book is, it's called, what is it? Pleasing Old Massa? Okay. I always got to remember this. Sometimes, y'all, I forget the names of some of the projects that I'm working on, but it's called Pleasing Old Massa. And the subtitle is A Brief History of Black Treachery, Flunkery, and Buffoonery.
Oh, wow.
And what I'm basically trying to do, I'm looking at it historically, going back, to the whole slave trade thing, and then bringing it up. And I'm just, and I do use those three categories, the traders, basically the race traders, the race buffoons, like Diamond and Silk would be, in the buffoon list. The traders, the buffoons, and what was the other group, baby? Traders, buffoons, flunkies.
Flunkies, right.
And the flunkies. And I would suggest to you that people like Gates would certainly be in the flunkies category. And anyway, what I try to do is I will talk about both people and events that demonstrate the flunkery, the buffoonery, or the treachery, treachery. Because I think one of my concerns right now, and just to focus on Gates for a second, one of my concerns right now is that because he has Harvard behind his name, we give him more credibility, more respect, more validation, because he went to, or he teaches at this enemy school that has never had our best interests at heart. And I think part of our miseducation is we got to move away from us validating our enemies in that way.
Whose line is it?
Instant credit.
Whose line is it that and I'm gonna clean it up a little bit, but that Harvard ruined more good black men than bad whiskey? Whose line is that?
Somebody said it.
Yeah, it's not my line. I can't take credit for it, but yeah, but you're right about that. I mean, you say Harvard, and even and I actually think even a lot of quietly wannabe radical black people subconsciously or unconsciously back up. When they hear that, they're like, "Ooh, Harvard!" Like they, So I think you're right about that. And listen, I know. I just wanted a quick programming note that we're going to reset our discussion here about George Jackson's Blood in My Eyes. We're going to start it next week when Dr. James is back in full effect. Absolutely, because it deserves so. We go double up on that, all the attention it can get. And I was even just reading for the first section today, initially scheduled for today, to Baba Kondo's point. George has a line in that first section we're reading in Blood in My Eye where he talks about even making room for those maybe not like Gates, but who have mistakenly been caught up in the poor messaging and narratives about our history and our struggle, who are not, willfully or consciously manipulating it, but who are just caught up in the negative stereotyping and fantasy that he is arguing we need to break through to get to a more revolutionary consciousness and behavior, which is why I think your work is essential. You clearly exemplify, from my point of view, what a guerrilla intellectual is. And I just want to thank you again for your
Okay.
Yeah.
Hey, my wife just handed me. Okay. My wife,
okay.
who by the way is the smartest person that I know.
Hey.
She just handed me
Good
a
answer.
note saying that the quote that you just quoted from was from Carter G. Woodson.
Okay, right on.
Mm.
Perfect.
Okay.
Black History Month. Here we are, right?
So there you go.
There it is. That's right. Thank you.
I like how you work. I like how you worked in. She's the smartest person I know. Well, you about to get a good breakfast, huh?
Yeah. Hey, and a tip to all of us who married up. Congratulations. Yeah.
We appreciate that, Bob. Thank you.
Hey,
Thank you very
listen.
much.
And I want to point out too, because I haven't I don't know if I said it yet, but tomorrow we're going to do a 4.5 hour tribute to El Haj Malik Shabazz, which will include it'll be a double interview from we did last year with I want to say Peter and Paul Lee and Peter Goldman, and then the piece we did with you last year as well, Baba. I think that I'm trying to figure out what time to launch it. I guess I'm gonna say 7 o'clock. Y'all got to stay up late tomorrow, 4.5 hours. And I think, in my opinion, between those two interviews, it's a lot covered. We covered a lot today, and definitely we appreciate you coming on. This is one day before the anniversary. What is this? Would it be the 68th?
The 50, I think it's the 58th. The 58th.
58th. I'm sorry. 58th anniversary. Excuse me. Commemoration of the assassination of El Haj Malik Shabazz, Malcolm X, Wale, and I'm saying that because to me, as they say, it hit different. I wasn't here when Malcolm was alive. I was born 5 years later. However, his impact on my life and so many others it's to me, it's like it's a day of mourning, and at the same time a day of celebration when it comes to the life of someone who proved himself beyond the individual. I think that his legacy is important because we get caught up in cult of personality sometimes, and we don't view what the what it means to the whole. So definitely tomorrow at 7 p.m. right here on Black Power Media, we will be broadcasting this double piece. But definitely we appreciate you, Baba Zak, for your contribution, and we're looking forward to more convos with you.
Okay, I appreciate it. Can I make one final statement?
Hey, if you don't, I'm gonna be mad at you.
I was just listening to you, Baba, and it brought to mind in 2016 I was invited to go to England, with this some serious brothers and sisters in the London area, and I did about a 4 or 5 day speaking tour. But this is what amazed me. The seriousness, it was, the seriousness that these brothers and sisters had when it came to Malcolm X, or when it came to Africans in the diaspora and stuff. It just reminded me of just how universal, Malcolm is appreciated, because the whole program, most of the stuff that I talked about was Malcolm X. That's what they brought me there to do. And the seriousness that these brothers and sisters, and not only that, but their knowledge of the history of Africans in the United States, it was amazing. And I would love to connect y'all with those brothers and sisters. However we can basically do that. So I just wanted to just bring that in.
Hey, Baba, let us know. We'd be honored. We're always looking to build with comrades and brothers and sisters globally. It is. I mean, to me, like I said, I don't understand folks who don't make an effort to understand someone like Malcolm, because again, for those of us who come from the other side of the fence, where oftentimes we made decisions that weren't to the best interest of us. He's definitely a light at the end of the tunnel. So definitely, we appreciate
Exactly.
your efforts and your energy, and give our regards and love to your wife, and we appreciate you coming on and joining us.
Thank y'all for inviting me. It's always been one of my great honors to communicate with with brothers and sisters of y'all's caliber. So I'm just keep doing what y'all are doing. We're real proud of y'all. Keep doing what you're doing.
Yes,
Yeah,
sir,
and we do regularly tune in. My wife even more than I do.
Okay. Now I gotta watch.
Y'all got a true fan.
Y'all
got a true fan, y'all.
Okay. Well, definitely we appreciate you all checking us out, man. We don't think anybody be looking at us anytime. We just think we're rambling and talking trash. But definitely, we appreciate you all for sure.
All right. Thank y'all.
Right on. Peace. You checking out Guerrilla Intellectual University. That was Baba Zak Kondo. As we mentioned earlier, as Dr. Jared Ball mentioned, we'll be hopping back on the whole Blood in My Eye piece. We will give you the opportunity. We're giving all of us the opportunity to read a little bit more. We have our schedule listed on our Twitter page. We also have a link inside of the body of this particular video, where if you don't have the book Blood in My Eye, you can actually download a PDF and study along with us. Next week we'll be back hardcore with it, and definitely we appreciate all that you all are doing in assisting us here at Black Power Media. Continue to be strong, and till next time. Matter of fact, not next time. Tune in tomorrow. Tomorrow morning will be what do we have tomorrow morning? Remix Morning Show, 8 a.m. EST to 10 a.m. EST. Y'all be safe out there. I'm forgetting what station I'm on. What show. Guerrilla Intellectual University. Peace.